The yellow school bus rumbled down the same route it had taken for the past 15 years. Behind the wheel sat Robert Chen, a man whose hair had gone completely gray during his time driving children to and from Lincoln Elementary School. Every morning at 6:30 he'd start his route, and every afternoon at 3:15 he'd do it all over again. Most drivers would find the job boring, doing the same thing day after day. But Robert had a different way of looking at it. He saw himself as more than just a driver. He was often the first friendly face these kids saw in the morning, and the last one before they went home. That meant something to him. On this particular September morning, the air had that crisp feeling that comes right before fall really settles in. Robert picked up kids at 7 different stops, and by the time he reached the last one, the bus was pretty full. The noise level was what you'd expect from 30 kids between the ages of 5 and 12. Some were laughing, others were comparing homework answers, and a few were still half asleep. But there was one boy who was always silent. His name was Tommy Reeves, and he was 12 years old. Every single morning, Tommy would climb onto the bus at the 6th stop, walk straight to the back, and sit in the last row by the window. He never talked to anyone, never played around like the other kids, just stared out that window like he was watching a movie only he could see. Robert had noticed Tommy 3 years ago when the boy first started taking his bus. Back then, Tommy had been 9, and there was something different about him even then. While other kids would rush to sit with their friends, Tommy seemed like he was trying to disappear into the seats. Through bits and pieces of conversation Robert had overheard from teachers and other students, he learned that Tommy lived at Riverside Children's Home. The boy had lost both his parents in an accident, and he had no other family to take him in. That explained a lot. Robert had seen plenty of kids from difficult situations over his years of driving. Some acted out, causing trouble and picking fights. Others, like Tommy, just went quiet. They built walls around themselves because it felt safer than letting anyone get close. This morning was different, though. As Tommy climbed onto the bus, Robert noticed something that made his chest tighten. The boy was shivering. The temperature had dropped overnight, and there was a cold drizzle falling. Tommy wore the same thin hoodie he'd been wearing since the school year started 2 weeks ago. No jacket, no umbrella. His sneakers were soaked through, leaving wet footprints down the aisle. Robert watched in his big rearview mirror as Tommy took his usual seat. The boy wrapped his arms around himself, trying to create warmth that wasn't there. His lips had a slight blue tint to them. Something stirred in Robert's heart. It was one thing to be alone in the world. It was another thing entirely to be cold and have no one notice. The morning route continued as normal. Robert dropped the kids off at school, watched them file into the building, and then drove the empty bus back to the depot. But he couldn't stop thinking about Tommy shivering in that back seat. That afternoon, before starting his pickup route, Robert made a decision. He went to his locker at the bus depot and pulled out his spare jacket. It was a simple navy blue windbreaker, nothing fancy, but it was warm and waterproof. His wife had bought it for him last Christmas, insisting he needed a backup in case his regular jacket got wet. Robert folded the jacket neatly and placed it on the back seat of the bus, right where Tommy always sat. He didn't leave a note, didn't make a big deal out of it, just left it there and started his afternoon route. When he pulled up to Lincoln Elementary, the usual chaos of dismissal was in full swing. Kids poured out of the building, shouting and laughing, eager to get home. Robert kept his eyes on the door, waiting for Tommy to appear. The boy came out last, as always. He walked with his head down, backpack slung over one shoulder. When he climbed onto the bus, Robert gave him a small nod, the same greeting he gave all the kids. Tommy nodded back slightly and headed to his usual spot. Robert pulled the bus away from the curb and started driving. He forced himself not to look in the rearview mirror right away. He didn't want to make Tommy feel watched or uncomfortable, but after a few minutes, curiosity got the better of him. He glanced up and saw Tommy holding the jacket, looking at it with an expression Robert couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe? Or surprise? The boy looked around the bus as if trying to figure out where it came from. Then slowly he put it on. It was too big, of course. The sleeves hung past his hands and the bottom of the jacket reached his thighs. But Tommy pulled it close around himself, and for the first time since Robert had known him, the boy's face seemed to relax just a little bit. Robert felt a warmth in his own chest that had nothing to do with the heater running in the bus. It was such a small thing, really. just an old jacket that had been sitting in a locker. But sometimes small things matter more than we realize. The rest of the ride was quiet as usual. When they reached Tommy's stop at Riverside Children's Home, the boy stood up, still wearing the jacket. He walked down the aisle, and just before stepping off the bus, he turned back and looked at Robert. Their eyes met for just a second. Tommy didn't say anything, but there was something in his expression that spoke louder than words. A question, maybe, or the beginning of trust. Then he was gone, walking up the path to the children's home, hands tucked into the pockets of his new jacket. Robert sat there for a moment before closing the bus doors and continuing his route. He didn't know it yet, but that simple act of leaving a jacket on a seat was the first step in a journey that would change both of their lives forever. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. And sometimes all it takes is one person who decides to notice. The next morning, Tommy wore the jacket onto the bus. Robert noticed it immediately but didn't say anything. He just gave the boy his usual nod and continued driving. In the rearview mirror, he could see Tommy settling into his seat, still quiet but somehow sitting a little straighter than before. Days turned into weeks, and the jacket became part of Tommy's daily routine. Robert never mentioned it, and Tommy never asked where it came from. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a small connection that neither one wanted to disturb with too many words. But Robert's curiosity about the quiet boy in the back of the bus kept growing. One morning in early October, after dropping off all the other kids at their various stops, Tommy was the last one remaining. As the boy stood to leave, Robert decided to take a chance. "Hey," he called out gently. "How's school going?" Tommy froze halfway down the aisle. He turned slowly, looking surprised that anyone was talking to him. For a moment, Robert thought the boy might just ignore him and walk off the bus, but then Tommy spoke. "It's okay," he said quietly. His voice was softer than Robert expected. "What's your favorite subject?" Robert asked, keeping his tone casual and friendly. Tommy thought about this for a second. "Math, I guess. Yeah? You good at it?" A small shrug. "I don't know, maybe." It wasn't much of a conversation, but it was a start. Robert smiled. "Well, have a good day at school." Tommy nodded and stepped off the bus, but this time he glanced back before walking away. That glance told Robert he'd done the right thing by reaching out. After that day, Robert made it a point to say something to Tommy every morning and afternoon. Nothing heavy or complicated, just simple questions. "Cold enough for you today?" Or "Weekend coming up, got any plans?" Most of the time, Tommy's answers were short. But he was answering, and that was what mattered. One afternoon in late October, as Tommy was leaving the bus, Robert noticed something concerning. The boy had been holding his stomach on and off during the entire ride home. His face looked pale, too. "You feeling all right?" Robert asked. Tommy nodded quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine," but Robert wasn't convinced. The next day, he paid closer attention. When Tommy got on the bus in the afternoon, Robert caught something in the boy's expression. A kind of tiredness that went beyond just being sleepy, and when Tommy sat down, he immediately pulled out a textbook and started reading, like he was trying to distract himself from something. That's when Robert realized what was going on. The boy was hungry. Robert thought about all the mornings he'd seen Tommy get on the bus. He'd never seen the boy eating breakfast. Never saw him with a lunchbox or money to buy food at school. The pieces started falling into place. That evening, Robert talked to his wife Linda about it. They'd been married for 32 years, and she knew her husband well enough to see when something was bothering him. "There's this kid on my route," Robert said as they cleaned up after dinner. "Lives at the children's home. I don't think he's getting enough to eat." Linda stopped wiping the counter and looked at him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking tomorrow I pack an extra sandwich. Maybe some fruit. I'll tell him you made too much and I can't let it go to waste." Linda smiled. The kind of smile that reminded Robert why he'd fallen in love with her all those years ago. "I'll help you pack it." The next morning, Robert had a brown paper bag sitting on the dashboard of the bus. Inside were 2 sandwiches, an apple, a bag of chips, and a bottle of juice. When Tommy got on the bus, Robert waited until they were between stops, then called back to him. "Hey, Tommy, come here for a second." The boy looked worried as he made his way to the front. Robert could see him trying to figure out if he'd done something wrong. "My wife, she always packs me too much food," Robert said, holding up the bag. "I can't possibly eat all this. You want it? Otherwise, it's just going to sit in my locker all day and go bad." Tommy stared at the bag like it might disappear if he looked away. Are you sure? Absolutely. You'd actually be doing me a favor. Slowly, Tommy reached out and took the bag. Thank you, he whispered. No problem, kid. From that day on, Robert always had an extra lunch for Tommy, and every single time, he'd give the same excuse about Linda packing too much food. Tommy probably knew the truth, but he never questioned it. He just accepted the kindness gratefully. As the weeks went by, Robert noticed changes in Tommy. The boy had more energy. His face didn't look so pale anymore, and bit by bit he started talking more. Not a lot, but enough that Robert was learning little things about him. Tommy loved reading, especially science fiction books. He was good at fixing things, and had once taken apart a broken radio at the children's home just to see how it worked. He wanted to learn how to play chess but didn't know anyone who could teach him. I could teach you, Robert offered one day. I'm not a master or anything, but I know how the game works. I've got a chess set at home. Tommy's eyes lit up in a way Robert had never seen before. Really? Sure, my lunch break is 30 minutes. We could play a game or two at the depot if you want. I can pick you up from school on my break. And that's exactly what they started doing. 3 times a week during Robert's lunch break, Tommy would meet him at the bus depot. They'd sit at the old table in the break room and Robert would teach him chess. At first, Tommy made simple mistakes, moving pieces the wrong way or forgetting what each one could do. But he learned fast, really fast. By November, Tommy was giving Robert a real challenge. The boy could think several moves ahead, seeing patterns and possibilities that Robert sometimes missed. It was impressive to watch his mind work. Other drivers at the depot noticed, of course. A couple of them asked Robert about the kid who came to visit him at lunch. Robert kept it simple, just said he was teaching a student chess. He didn't go into details about Tommy's situation. The boy's privacy mattered. One cold afternoon in late November, Tommy arrived at the bus for the ride home, and Robert could tell something was different. The boy was smiling. Actually smiling. It was small, barely there, but it was real. Good day? Robert asked. I got an A on my math test, Tommy said, and there was pride in his voice. The teacher said it was the highest score in the class. That's fantastic. See, I told you that you were good at it. Tommy clutched his backpack straps, still smiling. Nobody's ever really noticed before. That I'm good at something, I mean. Robert's heart squeezed in his chest. Well, I'm noticing now, and I'm proud of you. Those words hung in the air between them. Tommy's eyes got a little shiny, but he blinked quickly and nodded. Then he headed to his seat at the back of the bus, sitting in that jacket that was still too big for him, holding a lunch bag that he didn't know Linda had spent extra time preparing that morning. And for the first time in 3 years, Tommy didn't feel quite so invisible anymore. December brought cold winds and early darkness, but it also brought something unexpected. Robert was driving his afternoon route when he overheard a conversation that changed everything. 2 girls were sitting in the middle of the bus, struggling with their math homework. They were getting frustrated, their voices rising as they argued about how to solve a problem. This doesn't make any sense, one of them complained loudly. Why do we even need to learn this stuff? Robert was about to suggest they save the homework for when they got home. But before he could say anything, a quiet voice came from the back of the bus. It's 42. Everyone turned to look at Tommy. He was looking down at his own book, but he'd clearly heard their conversation. What? One of the girls asked. Your answer? It's 42. You have to multiply first, then add. Order of operations. The girls looked at each other, then checked their answer key. Their mouths fell open. He's right, one of them said, sounding amazed. The other girl turned in her seat. How did you do that so fast? We've been working on this problem for 10 minutes. Tommy shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the attention. I don't know. I just looked at it. Robert's eyes met Tommy's in the rearview mirror. The boy looked away quickly, but Robert had seen something in that brief glance. A flash of intelligence, of capability, that went deeper than anyone had realized. That evening, Robert couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. When he got home, he told Linda the whole story. You should have seen it, he said, leaning against the kitchen counter while she made tea. He solved that problem in seconds. The kind of problem that was giving those other kids fits. And he did it like it was nothing. Linda handed him a cup of tea and sat down at the table. Sounds like he's gifted. That's what I'm thinking. But here's the thing. Nobody knows. He sits in the back of that bus every day, barely talks to anyone, and all this potential is just going to waste. What are you thinking, Robert? Linda knew that tone in her husband's voice. He was planning something. Robert sat down across from her. There's a regional math competition coming up in March. I saw a flyer about it at the school. It's for middle school kids. Winners get scholarships, recognition, all that stuff. And you think Tommy should enter? I think Tommy could win. But there's a catch. Entry fee is $75. Plus he'd need study materials and preparation books. The children's home isn't going to pay for that. They're already stretched thin with basic necessities. Linda was quiet for a moment, sipping her tea. Then she set down her cup and looked at her husband with that determined expression he'd come to know so well over the years. We have some money saved up, she said, and I taught 7th grade math for 20 years before I retired. I could tutor him. Robert felt a weight lift off his chest. Are you sure? It's a lot of time and effort. Robert, you've been coming home every day for the past 3 months talking about this boy, bringing him food, teaching him chess, worrying about whether he's warm enough. You care about him, and if you care about him, then so do I. The next afternoon, Robert asked Tommy to stay on the bus after all the other kids had gotten off. The boy looked nervous as he walked down the aisle to the front. Am I in trouble? Tommy asked quietly. No, nothing like that. Robert assured him quickly. I want to talk to you about something. Something good. He pulled out the flyer about the math competition and handed it to Tommy. The boy read it carefully, his eyes moving over every word. There's a math competition in March, Robert explained. It's for kids your age. The winners get scholarship money for college. Real money that could help your future. Tommy's hands were shaking slightly as he held the flyer. I'm not smart enough for something like this. Tommy, I heard you solve that problem yesterday. In your head. In seconds. You're absolutely smart enough. The boy shook his head. But I'm from the children's home. Kids like me don't do things like this. Robert felt his heart break a little. Listen to me. Where you live doesn't define what you can do. You have a gift, Tommy, a real gift for math. And gifts like that shouldn't be wasted. But it costs money. I don't have $75. My wife and I want to pay for it. And Linda, she used to be a math teacher. She wants to help you prepare. We can do sessions in the evenings a few times a week. Tommy looked up at Robert with wide eyes. Why would you do that for me? It was a fair question, and Robert had been thinking about the answer for a while now. He chose his words carefully. Because sometimes in life we need someone to believe in us, someone to see our potential even when we can't see it ourselves. You've been that invisible kid at the back of the bus for too long, Tommy. It's time people saw you, really saw you. Tears started forming in Tommy's eyes. He blinked them back hard, but they came anyway. I don't know what to say. Say you'll try. That's all I'm asking. Give yourself this chance. Tommy wiped his eyes with the sleeve of the jacket Robert had given him months ago. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, Okay, I'll try. Robert smiled, feeling a surge of hope and determination. Good, we start next week. Linda's going to prepare a study plan. We've got 3 months to get you ready. Over the next few days, Robert noticed another change in Tommy. The boy carried himself differently. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Purpose, maybe, or hope. Perhaps both. When Robert told the director of Riverside Children's Home about the competition and their plan to help Tommy prepare, the woman was surprised but supportive. She admitted that Tommy had always been quiet and easy to overlook, but his teachers did mention he was good with numbers. Nobody's ever taken this kind of interest in him before, the director said. This could be really good for him. He needs to know someone believes he's worth investing in. That was exactly what Robert and Linda intended to show him. The following Monday evening, Tommy came to Robert and Linda's house for the first time. It was a small, neat home with a garden Linda tended carefully. Tommy stood on the front porch looking nervous, clutching a notebook and a pencil. Linda opened the door with a warm smile. You must be Tommy. I'm Linda. Come on in. The house smelled like cookies. Linda had baked them that afternoon, thinking a 12-year-old boy might appreciate a snack while studying. She was right. Tommy's eyes went straight to the plate on the kitchen table. Help yourself, Linda said. Can't study on an empty stomach. As Tommy sat at their kitchen table eating cookies and opening his notebook, Robert caught Linda's eye. She gave him a small nod, and he knew they were thinking the same thing. This was about more than a math competition. This was about showing a lonely boy that he mattered, that his future was worth fighting for, that someone saw him, really saw him, and believed he could be something more than just the quiet kid at the back of the bus. And as Linda began explaining the first math concept, her voice patient and encouraging, Tommy leaned forward and listened like his life depended on it. Because maybe, in a way it did. The winter months passed in a blur of numbers, formulas, and steadily growing confidence. 3 evenings a week, Robert would pick up Tommy from Riverside Children's Home and drive him to their house. Linda would have the kitchen table set up like a classroom, with practice problems, textbooks, and always a plate of something freshly baked. At first, Tommy was hesitant. He'd get frustrated when he didn't understand something right away, and Linda could see him starting to shut down, the way he probably did at school when things got hard. But Linda had taught hundreds of students over her career, and she knew how to reach them. She'd sit beside Tommy, not across from him, and work through problems step by step. When he got something right, she'd celebrate it. When he got something wrong, she'd show him why without making him feel stupid. Mistakes are how we learn, she'd say. Every wrong answer is just showing us the path to the right one. Slowly but surely, Tommy began to transform. His confidence grew with each session. He started asking questions instead of staying silent. He'd work through problems out loud, explaining his thinking. And he was fast, really fast. What amazed Linda most was how he could see patterns in numbers that most kids his age would miss completely. One evening in late January, Linda gave Tommy a practice test from a previous year's competition. She set a timer and told him to do his best. Then she left him alone at the kitchen table while she joined Robert in the living room. "How's he doing?" Robert asked quietly. "Better than I expected," Linda admitted. "Robert, I think he might actually have a real shot at placing in this competition." "That good?" "That good. I've never seen a mind work quite like his with numbers. It's like he's having a conversation with the math instead of just solving problems." 40 minutes later, Tommy emerged from the kitchen looking exhausted but satisfied. Linda graded his test while he ate dinner with them, something that had become a regular routine. "Meatloaf and mashed potatoes tonight, Tommy's favorite." When Linda finished grading, she looked up with wide eyes. "Tommy, you scored 92%. Tommy stopped mid-bite. "Is that good?" "Good. Honey, that's excellent. That score would have placed you 3rd in last year's competition." The fork slipped from Tommy's hand and clattered on his plate. "3rd place, really?" Robert reached over and squeezed the boy's shoulder. "I told you. You're special, kid." That night, as Robert drove Tommy back to the children's home, the boy was quiet, but in a different way than before. Not the silence of someone trying to disappear, but the silence of someone deep in thought, beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than he'd ever imagined. The other kids at Riverside had noticed the change too. Tommy wasn't invisible anymore. During free time, some of the younger kids started asking him for help with their homework. He'd sit with them patiently, explaining things in simple ways, the same way Linda explained things to him. The staff at the home noticed he smiled more, stood taller, engaged with others. "Whatever you're doing for that boy," the director told Robert one afternoon when he came to pick up Tommy, "please keep doing it. He's like a different child." February brought the reality of the approaching competition date. It was scheduled for the first Saturday in March, just 3 weeks away. Linda increased their practice sessions to 4 times a week. She introduced timed drills, harder problems, competition strategies. Tommy rose to every challenge. Some nights he'd stay until 9 o'clock, working through problem sets until his hand cramped from writing. Robert would drive him home and they'd talk about school, life, dreams for the future. Things Tommy had never felt safe talking about before. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Robert asked one night. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I used to think it didn't matter, that kids like me don't get to have those kinds of dreams. And now I think maybe I could be an engineer. Or a teacher like Mrs. Chen. Someone who helps people, you know." Robert had to blink back tears. "You can be anything you want, Tommy. Don't ever forget that." The week before the competition, Linda ran Tommy through one final practice test. He scored 96%. She hugged him tight, something she'd started doing over the past few months, and he hugged her back without hesitation. "You're ready," she told him. "Whatever happens at that competition, you should be proud of how far you've come." But Tommy wasn't satisfied with just being proud. He wanted to win. The morning of the competition, Robert picked up Tommy extra early. The boy was wearing his best clothes, which Linda had helped him pick out at a thrift store the week before. Khaki pants, a button-up shirt, and that navy blue jacket that had started everything months ago. The competition was being held at the university, in a big lecture hall that made Tommy's eyes go wide. There were kids from all over the region, some with their parents, some with teachers. Tommy had Robert and Linda, and right then that felt like more than enough. They registered Tommy and got his assigned seat. Linda knelt down to his level and looked him in the eyes. Remember, this isn't about winning or losing. This is about showing yourself what you're capable of. You've already won by getting here. Tommy nodded, but his hands were shaking. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. Hey, remember our chess games? How you learn to think ahead, to see the whole board? Yeah, math is just another kind of game, and you're really good at games. That made Tommy smile. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked into the testing room with 100 other kids. The next 2 hours were the longest of Robert and Linda's lives. They sat in the waiting area, drinking terrible coffee and not saying much. Other parents chatted around them, but they just sat there, hoping and praying that this day would be everything Tommy needed it to be. When the doors finally opened and the kids streamed out, they scanned the crowd for Tommy. They found him standing off to the side, looking dazed. How'd it go? Robert asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Tommy looked up at them and there were tears in his eyes. For a heart-stopping moment, Robert thought it had gone badly, but then Tommy smiled, a huge, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. I finished every single problem, he said, his voice filled with wonder, and I knew how to do all of them. Every single one. Linda pulled him into a hug. That's wonderful, sweetheart. We're so proud of you. They wouldn't know the results for 2 weeks. The waiting would be hard. But as they walked out of that university building together, Robert looked at the boy between him and Linda, and he knew that no matter what the results said, something profound had already happened. Tommy had learned to believe in himself, and that was worth more than any prize. The 2 weeks of waiting felt like 2 years. Every day Tommy would ask Robert if the results had come yet. Every day Robert would shake his head and remind him that these things took time. But inside, Robert was just as anxious as the boy. He and Linda talked about it every night. What if Tommy didn't place? What if all this work, all this hope they'd built up came crashing down? Would it hurt him? Would it make him retreat back into that shell they'd worked so hard to break through? Linda, always the wiser of the two, had a different perspective. Even if he doesn't win, look at what's already happened. He knows someone cares about him. He knows he's capable of great things. That doesn't go away, no matter what some test results say. She was right, of course, but Robert still hoped. He hoped hard. On a Thursday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks and 3 days after the competition, Robert was doing his afternoon route when his phone rang. It was the director from Riverside Children's Home, and her voice was shaking with excitement. Robert, a letter came for Tommy today, from the Regional Math Competition Association. I didn't open it, but I thought you should know. Robert's heart started pounding. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He finished his route in record time, making the other kids wonder why their bus driver was suddenly in such a hurry. When they reached Tommy's stop, Robert called him up to the front. Letter came for you today, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Competition results. Tommy's face went pale. Did they say what it was? Nobody opened it. It's waiting for you. Linda's meeting us at the home. We thought you might want us there when you read it. The drive to Riverside felt endless. Tommy sat in the front seat, bouncing his leg nervously. Neither of them said much. What was there to say? Linda's car was already in the parking lot when they arrived. She was standing on the front steps with the director, holding a white envelope. When she saw them pull up, she smiled, but Robert could see the worry in her eyes too. Tommy practically ran from the bus. The four of them stood there in a small circle, the envelope in the center like it held the secrets of the universe. You want to open it? Linda asked gently. Tommy's hands were shaking too much. I can't. You do it. Linda carefully tore open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Her eyes scanned the contents, and then she stopped breathing. Her hand went to her mouth. What? Tommy asked, his voice cracking. Is it bad? Linda looked up and tears were streaming down her face. But she was smiling. Actually smiling, Tommy, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You got first place. Time seemed to stop. Tommy stared at her like he hadn't heard right. First place, Linda repeated, out of 147 students. You had the highest score in the entire competition. The director gasped. Robert felt his knees go weak. And Tommy just stood there frozen, like his brain couldn't process what he was hearing. That means you've won a $50,000 scholarship for college, Linda continued, reading from the letter. And you're invited to represent the region at the state competition in May. I won? Tommy whispered. I actually won? You won, kid, Robert said, his own voice breaking. You won. And then Tommy broke down. Not sad crying, but the kind of crying that comes when every emotion you've been holding inside for years suddenly breaks free. He sobbed like a little kid, and Linda pulled him into her arms and held him tight while he let it all out. Robert and the director stood there with tears in their own eyes, watching this boy who'd been invisible for so long finally being seen in the biggest way possible. When Tommy finally calmed down, his face red and puffy but transformed by the biggest smile any of them had ever seen on him, the director invited them all inside for hot chocolate. They sat in her office, passing the letter around, reading it over and over like they couldn't quite believe it was real. The local paper wants to do a story, the director said. And Channel 7 News called. They want to interview Tommy. Tommy looked panicked. On TV? You don't have to if you don't want to, Robert assured him. But it might be nice. Your story could inspire other kids. Over the next few days, Tommy's life changed in ways none of them could have predicted. The newspaper ran a front-page story with his picture. The TV interview aired during the evening news. Suddenly, people all over town knew about the boy from Riverside Children's Home who'd won the regional math competition. Donations started pouring into the children's home. Local businesses wanted to sponsor Tommy for the state competition. A professor from the state university's mathematics department called and offered Tommy a place in a special summer program for gifted students, but the biggest change came 2 weeks after the results were announced. Robert and Linda asked Tommy to come over for dinner on a Saturday evening. He showed up at 6 o'clock like always, but this time they were dressed up a little nicer than usual. What's going on? Tommy asked, sensing something was different. They sat him down at the kitchen table and Linda took his hand. Robert sat on the other side, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Tommy, Linda began, we've been talking a lot over the past few months. About you, about us, about what the future might look like. Tommy's eyes darted between them nervously. Robert took over. You've become really important to us. You're not just some kid on my bus route anymore. You're family. We talked to the director at Riverside, Linda continued, and to a social worker, and to a lawyer. Tommy's breathing got faster. He looked scared, like he was bracing for bad news. We want to know if you'd like to live with us, Robert said, the words tumbling out. Permanently. We want to adopt you, Tommy, if you want that too. The silence that followed felt like forever. Tommy stared at them with wide eyes, his mouth slightly open. A single tear rolled down his cheek. You want me? He whispered. Linda squeezed his hand. We don't just want you. We love you. We have for a while now. Tommy's face crumpled and he started crying again, but through the tears he managed to say the word that changed everything. Yes. The legal process took 4 months. There were background checks, home visits, interviews, and mountains of paperwork. But in July, on a sunny Thursday afternoon, Tommy officially became Tommy Chen. His last name changed, but more importantly, so did everything else. He moved into the spare bedroom that Linda had already started decorating. He had a real home now with a real family. People who loved him not because they had to, but because they chose to. In August, Tommy competed in the state math competition and placed second. The scholarship money grew to $75,000. More than enough for college, which was still 6 years away but suddenly felt possible. Actually possible. Robert continued driving his bus route, but now when he looked in the rearview mirror, Tommy wasn't sitting in the back alone. He sat in the front, right behind Robert, talking about his day, making plans for the weekend, being a regular kid with a regular life. The other kids at school noticed the change too. Tommy made friends. He joined the math club and the chess team. He tutored younger students twice a week after school. The invisible boy had become impossible to miss. 2 years later, when Tommy was 14, he started a program at Riverside Children's Home. He called it Someone Sees You. Every week, he'd go back to the place he used to call home and tutor kids in math and science. But more than that, he'd talk to them. Really talk to them. He'd tell them his story and remind them that where they started didn't determine where they could go. One afternoon, Robert went with him to one of these sessions. He watched Tommy working with a quiet 8-year-old girl who reminded him so much of Tommy at that age. Shy, unsure, like she was trying to disappear into the furniture, Tommy pulled out a chessboard and taught her to play, exactly the way Robert had taught him. And when the session was over, the little girl smiled. Just a small smile, barely there, but it was real. On the drive home, Tommy was quiet in that thoughtful way he sometimes got. "What are you thinking about?" Robert asked. Tommy looked at his dad. That's what he called Robert now. Dad. The word had felt strange at first, but now it fit perfectly. "I was thinking about that day you left your jacket for me on the bus," Tommy said. "That was 2 years and 9 months ago. You remember the exact time?" "Of course I remember. That was the day everything started to change. That was the day someone first saw me." Robert's eyes got misty and he had to focus extra hard on the road. "You know what the weird thing is?" Tommy continued. "I thought you saved me, but I think maybe we saved each other." Robert thought about the man he'd been before Tommy came into his life, going through the motions, driving the same route every day, feeling like his life didn't matter much in the grand scheme of things. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think you might be right about that." That evening, the Chen family sat around their dinner table, the three of them together. Linda had made pot roast, Tommy's favorite. They talked about school, about the upcoming chess tournament, about the college fair that Tommy wanted to attend even though he was only 14. After dinner, Tommy went to do his homework and Robert helped Linda clean up. She leaned against him as they stood at the sink and he wrapped his arm around her. "You know what I love most about our story?" she said. "What's that?" "It started with a jacket. Just a simple act of noticing, and it changed 3 lives forever." Robert kissed the top of her head and looked toward the hallway, where he could hear Tommy on the phone, laughing with a friend about something that happened at school that day. A simple act of noticing. That's all it took. One person deciding that another person mattered. One jacket, one sandwich, one chess game, one evening of math tutoring. Small acts that added up to something bigger than any of them could have imagined. Sometimes we think we need to do grand gestures to change the world, but the truth is, the world changes one person at a time, one small kindness at a time, one moment of seeing and being seen. Tommy had been invisible for so long, but now he shone so bright that everyone could see him, and he made sure to use that light to help others who were still sitting in the darkness, waiting for someone to notice them too. Because that's what happens when someone changes your destiny. You don't keep it to yourself. You pass it on. You become the person for someone else that someone once was for you. And the cycle of kindness continues, spreading outward like ripples in water, touching lives in ways we might never fully know. All because a bus driver looked in his rearview mirror and decided that the quiet boy in the back seat mattered. That he was worth a jacket, a sandwich sometime, and eventually a family. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything. Someone who sees you, really sees you, and decides you're worth their kindness. That's how destinies change. Not with grand gestures, but with small acts of love that add up to something extraordinary. 10 years later, Robert Chen stood in the audience of a university auditorium. His hair now completely white, his hand clasped tightly in Linda's. His room was packed with families, professors, and graduates dressed in caps and gowns. Somewhere in that sea of people was the young man they'd come to see. "Can you believe it's been 10 years?" Linda whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd brought specifically for this moment. Robert shook his head. Sometimes it felt like yesterday that he'd first seen that quiet 12-year-old boy shivering on his bus. Other times it felt like Tommy had always been their son, like their family had always been complete. The ceremony began, and Robert tried to pay attention to the speeches, but his mind kept wandering back through the years. Tommy's high school graduation, where he'd been valedictorian, the countless math competitions he'd won, the summer programs and internships, the full scholarship to this prestigious engineering school. Every milestone had felt like a miracle. But more than the achievements, Robert remembered the small moments. Teaching Tommy to ride a bike when he was 13, their Sunday morning chess matches that had continued all these years. The time Tommy had called him Dad for the first time without hesitation. The way he'd grown from a scared, invisible boy into a confident young man who knew his worth. Tommy Chen, The announcer's voice rang through the auditorium. Robert and Linda jumped to their feet, clapping louder than anyone else in the room. There he was, walking across that stage in his graduation gown, a huge smile on his face. 22 years old now, about to receive his degree in mechanical engineering with highest honors. Tommy accepted his diploma, shook hands with the university president, and then did something unexpected. He stepped to the microphone that was set up for graduate speakers. "Excuse me," Tommy said, his voice carrying through the sound system. "I know this isn't the usual protocol, but I need to say something." The auditorium fell quiet. Robert felt Linda grip his arm. 10 years ago, I was nobody." Tommy began, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Robert and Linda. "I was a kid who thought his life was already decided, that because I started with nothing, I'd end with nothing. But then a bus driver left a jacket on my seat. A simple act that most people wouldn't think twice about." Robert felt tears starting to form. Around them, people were listening intently. That bus driver and his wife didn't just give me food and shelter and tutoring. They gave me something bigger. They gave me a family. They showed me that my past didn't define my future, that I was worth investing in, worth loving, worth believing in. Tommy's voice cracked slightly. "Robert and Linda Chen taught me that small acts of kindness can change everything. And because they changed my life, I get to spend the rest of my life changing others' lives. That's what engineering is really about. Building things that help people, making the world better, one small improvement at a time." The auditorium erupted in applause. Tommy stepped away from the microphone and Robert couldn't see clearly anymore because his eyes were too blurred with tears. After the ceremony, they found Tommy in the crowd outside. He'd removed his cap and his gown flapped in the spring breeze. When he saw them, he broke into a run, something he never would have done as that shy 12-year-old. He hugged them both tightly, and for a moment they just stood there, the three of them together, holding on to each other into this perfect moment. "We're so proud of you," Linda said, cupping Tommy's face in her hands the way she'd done since he was young. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Tommy said. "You know that, right?" Robert smiled through his tears. "We just gave you the chance, son. You did all the hard work. You gave me more than a chance. You gave me everything." Later that evening, at the small celebration dinner they'd planned, Tommy made an announcement. He'd accepted a job with an engineering firm that specialized in designing accessible technology for underserved communities. But that wasn't all. "I'm also starting a foundation," he said, looking at both his parents. "It's going to connect mentors with kids in foster care and children's homes. Help them find their talents, get into competitions, apply for scholarships. Everything you did for me, we're going to help others do for kids who need it." Linda gasped. "Tommy, that's wonderful. I'm calling it the Blue Jacket Project," he continued, "because that's where it all started. With one simple act of noticing, of caring. And I want to make sure no kid ever feels invisible again." Robert couldn't speak. His heart was too full. He looked at his son, this remarkable young man who'd taken his second chance and turned it into something that would give second chances to countless others. That night, driving home with Linda beside him, Robert thought about that morning 10 years ago when he'd left his spare jacket on a bus seat. Such a small thing. He'd never imagined where it would lead. One act of kindness had changed 3 lives. And now, through Tommy's foundation, it would change hundreds more, maybe thousands. "What are you thinking about?" Linda asked softly. Robert reached over and took her hand. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am that I looked in my rearview mirror that day, that I decided to see him. He changed our lives just as much as we changed his," Linda said. "Yeah," Robert agreed. "He really did." And somewhere across town, in a small apartment filled with engineering textbooks and blueprints for the future, Tommy sat at his desk working on plans for the Blue Jacket Project. On the wall above his desk hung that original navy blue windbreaker, framed and preserved. A reminder of where he'd come from and why he'd never stop reaching back to help others climb up. Because that's what love does. It multiplies. It spreads. It creates ripples that touch shores you never even knew existed. All from one jacket. One moment of kindness. One person who decided to see,